Thank you very much, Benedict. And also thank you to our speaker today, Alexandros Kyriatsis, and all the audience, the participants that are connecting to this new online talk organized by the European School of Administration on the initiative Hello Brussels. You know that we organize regularly events on this topic for not only for newcomers, but also all the colleagues that could be interested in different aspects of Brussels. Combined with this webinar format, we also have these guided tours, and we have a group in Teams that we will open up to all participants that will be interested. We will put the information afterwards in the mail that you will receive with the recording and the slides for today. So if you're interested, you can join the group and you will be informed of all the activities that we organize. Today we have the topic today will be architecture in Brussels, the overview. As we all know, Brussels is famous for its Art Nouveau architecture, but there are also many eras that are represented. We could all spend several days admiring the best examples of Brussels architecture from throughout the ages. Today we have the honor of having Alexandros again. You know, Alexandros, he has been working at the Commission for more than 20 years. He lives in Brussels, and more specifically in Odergem, since the end of 2006. He works in Directorate General for Environment at the Commission, and he's specialized in legislation on chemicals. In the recent years, he has been exploring the 19 communes in Brussels capital region and more in depth, and eventually also became Brussels greeter in 2019. Helping visitors and newcomers to discover Brussels like a local and off the beaten track has since become his passion. So I think with this nice curriculum, I would say, Alexandros, you are one of the best speakers today to give us this presentation. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello everybody. I will start sharing the screen so that you can actually see the presentation, and make that a little bit smaller. Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for the nice introduction, Blanca, and well, happy to be back to this new program and the Hello Brussels series of events. And as Blanca already mentioned, well, I'm Alexandros. So and apart from being a policy officer in DG in the European Commission in the DG for the environment, in my free time I'm also volunteering as a Brussels greeter. The Greeters are a worldwide charitable network organization, and we offer free and personalized guided walks. We welcome visitors, but also newcomers to Brussels, and take them on walks, showing them the city through a more personal lens and off the beaten track. Greeters aren't professional guides or experts. It's just ordinary people like you and me. And of course, if you're interested in taking a free and personalized walk, all you need to do is fill in the request form on the Brussels Greeters website, like all the links, all the information at the end of the presentation. Yeah, now that I've made a little bit of advertising for the organization that I volunteer for, now in this Hello Brussels series, we are several colleagues, as Blanca mentioned. We are also organizing walks and bike rides to complement the presentations that we're giving, and other topics. And also for this, Blanca already mentioned it, there will be a Microsoft Teams group that can be joined, but we will give you more information on that at the end of the presentation as well. And as Blanca already announced, there will be in the information, in the email that you will receive after this presentation, with the link to the video to the presentation, there will also be all the links and the necessary information how to get more information about the Hello Brussels initiative. But yeah, let's start with the topic of today, the architecture in Brussels, and why you should be aware of it. And so I'm giving you an overview of the main style of the architecture that can be found in Brussels today. But of course, I mean, I'm using the examples from Brussels, but in principle, architecture it's part of the Western architecture as it is visible all over the Western world. So the principal styles, of course, also apply wherever you are located, either in one of the 5 sites of the JRC, Luxembourg, in an agency, or wherever you are. So you can also apply that to your personal place, to the place where you live. So we are living in a city, and living in a city means that we're constantly surrounded by architecture. So it has a role for us, and your perception of this architecture will certainly influence how you feel about being in a certain place. If you do not understand what is surrounding you, you will keep feeling alien. And I've myself been living in Brussels for quite many years, and have not been very much impressed with the whole setup over here. But actually, since I started learning about architecture, all of a sudden I got a new perspective on things. And now I can relate and connect much better to Brussels. And with this presentation, I would like to cut that learning process a little bit short for you. Brussels actually has a very rich and diverse architecture and architectural heritage. And there are several architecture festivals that celebrate the different styles in the course of every year. And arguably, Brussels is world known for being the birthplace of a particular style of architecture, which is the Art Nouveau. And of course, I'm going to talk about that later. But Brussels was actually a relatively prosperous city throughout its history. So we will find examples of architecture from the Romanesque period to the postmodern architecture, which is basically the whole range of architectural styles that were around in the history of Brussels. Now, for the untrained eye, that may be a little bit confusing and, well, maybe even overwhelming. But on top of it, Brussels has suffered from a long absence of urban planning and appropriate heritage preservation, which has now massively improved. But it was absent for quite a long time. And then, of course, decades of air pollution have also added challenges to the ability to admiring the architecture of Brussels. But by the end of this presentation, I hope that you will have a good idea about the basic styles that we can find in Brussels, and maybe you will be able to recognize them in your next walk, like Blanca just explained. She recognized a few street art things after my street art presentation. So hopefully that is also now going to be the case for the architecture of Brussels. And I hope that this will then also contribute to your well-being and how you feel about living in Brussels. So that's why, so to help you understanding what is going on in Brussels in terms of architecture, yeah, as I said, I will give you the basic overview over the different architectural slides. You'll find them listed here in this on this time arrow. So starting with Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassicism, Historicism, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, Modernism, and to the postmodern, which is a period which we are currently living in. I will, of course, only be able to give you a short and brief generic introduction to all these different styles, but I will also want to give you a little bit the historical context, how they came about. And but I also want to say upfront that I'm not an architect or an art historian. Actually, my interest in artists and architecture only came about relatively recently when I started volunteering as a Brussels greeter. But it has really had an influence on me. So today we're not going to go into details, but I'm already sort of thinking of maybe doing more specialized online talks on a particular style, on particular styles in future. The dates that are indicated here for the various periods are to be handled with care, so to speak. There's never a real cut-off date, start date or cut-off date for any of those periods. So it's just to give you an orientation. There have always been frontcomers, people that front runners or late comers. So there were always people that still built in a style that was actually out of fashion and so on. So why are we talking about it? I mean, one of the objectives of Hello Brussels is to make you more familiar with Brussels, so that you're feeling more comfortable in your new hometown. But what exactly are the elements that will make you feel at home in a place? Of course, you need to find your way around. You need to know where to do your daily shopping and things like that. Family, friends, all that plays a role. But there's also a number of subconscious aspects. And these are the things that I try to focus on in my online talks. That was, for example, also the street art that I did earlier this year. But also the architecture has a role. Because, as I said, if you do not understand what is going on around you, what you see on a daily basis, it will be difficult to become familiar with the environment. So, for that reason, as a newcomer to a foreign city, understanding the architecture is surrounding us on a daily basis is an important, well, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe important is to exaggerate, but it is a step of getting. It contributes to make you feel more at home, and that's also the reason why I will focus in this presentation. I will focus more on the later styles. So I will go relatively quickly through the early styles because I would like to focus more on the styles that are actually more present in our day-to-day experience. Yeah, the wild mix of architecture in Brussels is difficult, and it's not really enticing on first sight. There are, of course, other cities in the world which on first sight look more attractive because they have a more homogeneous architecture, but this is normally a sign that a city flourished in a particular period for the one or the other reason and then stagnated. But because Brussels never really stagnated in its history, it was always a relatively important and international place. And of course, over time, buildings deteriorate, they get knocked down, other buildings get built. So there's a continuum here in Brussels. And so Brussels is giving us a completely different basic story here. It's not like one of those cities that stagnated and which we now admire, and where we like to go to visit places like Bruges, for example, which are definitely super pretty. Yeah, but they're, in terms of variety of architecture, certainly less exciting, although it is of course exciting going there. And the additional factor here in Brussels is, of course, also that we have 19 communes. So each of them have its own thing, which also contributes to a little bit of a complicated situation. So this wild mix that we're having in Brussels is in one way is quite special, but it has a different charm. It's not pleasing to the eye on the first sight, but it's a different aspect that we want. So I said that it's a result of the fact that throughout history Brussels has been an international place, a relatively international place, let's put it this way. Of course, it has become extremely international more recently, but I think it's important to know also this diversity that we're having in Brussels. Brussels is actually the second most cosmopolitan city in the world after Dubai. And the data that I found on this is from the 2015 World Migration Report, so it's a little bit aged, but I think the basic is definitely still true. So it's a World Migration Report from the International Organization for Migration, and that tells us that 62% of the population in the city of Brussels was foreign-born, and people from 166 nationalities, well, including us, all of us, of course, live in the city of Brussels itself. And when we look at the Brussels capital region as a whole, so all the 19 communes together, a whopping 71% of the inhabitants have foreign roots. And they're coming from 180 different countries, and they speak more than 100 different languages. So also there, we are seeing quite a wild mix. We're seeing quite a wild diversity. And in my opinion, I mean, nothing would fit more to that sort of community than also having a wild mix of architecture. So whatever you want to do, if you want to live in a fancy modern stainless steel glass apartment, do you want to live in a high rise, do you want to live in a suburb, in a garden idyll, multicultural neighborhood, whatever you want, everything is available in Brussels, and you will find something that fits your style. Huh? So that's just a little bit to give you a little bit the context. Now, how is this presentation going to work? I will always first show you a slide with the basic elements that are distinctive for each style. So like the slide that you're seeing here right at the moment. And then we will look at pictures that show some examples from all over the Brussels capital region that fit the style that I'm presenting. One more thing that I want to say up front, and that we should be aware of, that when we're looking at architecture, is that in particular when we're talking about the architecture from earlier periods, we need to be aware that we are primarily looking at architecture, or that we're primarily talking about things like castles, palaces, religious buildings, bridges, public buildings, and similar structures. So those were the things that were built in stone, and houses of the ordinary population, so to speak. Those that were not representing the rich society were built of wood, and those have most, of course, with the exception of a few farmhouses, they've long disappeared. Certainly for later periods, this is less true. But I think it's important to remain conscious that when we are looking at architecture, that we're predominantly looking at architecture of the richer parts of society and official public buildings. So representing the style as the authorities wanted to see themselves. So we're normally not looking at houses that represent the low income parts of the society. I think this is always something to be mindful of when talking about, or when we are looking at architecture, also when we're visiting other places. Of course, I wanted to mention that a little bit upfront. But now let's get started. As you can see, we're starting with the Romanesque architecture style. And the reason for that is because the oldest recorded records that we have of Brussels' existence date from this period, the end of the 10th century. So this is, of course, where everything starts. And of course, consequently, we cannot have older buildings in Brussels than Romanesque. The Romanesque architecture is a medieval type of architecture in Europe. It is characterized, as you can see in this sketch, also a little bit by these semicircular arches in all these, in their buildings. There is not, I mean, I put here the figure 1000, but actually there is no really start date. The discussion ranges from the 6th to the 11th century, so it's really an open beginning. It's not really clear when it started. And but Romanesque architecture is a type of architecture that we find all over Europe. It's the first pan-European style of architecture after the Imperial Roman architecture. Speaking of Roman architecture, Romanesque architecture actually combines elements of Roman and Byzantine architecture, picking up local traditions. And it is characterized by massive walls, round arches, sturdy pillars, barrel walls, large towers, and decorative arcading. Each building has a clearly defined form, often in a symmetrical plan, and the overall appearance is one of simplicity. Given that we are talking about the early days of the development in Brussels, not much of that period survived. There weren't that many rich and people around, and public buildings weren't built yet in stone. So, but what we can still see today as Romanesque, what we still see today as Romanesque, or as buildings built in a Romanesque style, actually very often dates from much later. This is particularly true for churches in more rural parts. That in those areas, the Romanesque style stayed alive much longer. Because in the rural parts, people weren't able to afford the more elaborate and more expensive Gothic style that followed the Romanesque period. So churches often were still built in a Romanesque style much later. However, within the city of Brussels, we can also still see the remains of the first and the second city wall. And they were certainly built in a Romanesque style, although for the top of you have to ignore the current roof on the top of Porte de Halle, because that was only added in the 19th century. Porte de Halle actually never had a roof originally. That was a fantastic addition. Well, not a fantastic, a fantasy addition. During the 19th century. So on top right, we see the Church of Saint Vincent in Hébert, and that the tower of the church was built between 1125 and 1250, but the church building itself is actually much later. It dates from 1527, so it's one of those examples that I said, well, they was simply built later in this sort of more simplistic Romanesque style. But what you can clearly see in those examples that we are showing here in the picture is the sturdiness and the simplicity of the structures. Moving on to the Gothic architecture, which was particularly popular in Europe from the 12th to the 16th century. And this type of architecture was first found in the Île-de-France region in northern France, so broadly speaking, the area around Paris. And the defining element of Gothic architecture is the pointed arch that we can see also in the sketch here. The use of the pointed arch in turn led to the development of the pointed rib vault, and then additional elements were flying buttresses, elaborate tracery. These are these things here that are in stone in the windows. Gothic architecture in particular emphasized verticality, so it's always upwards moving and the effect of light passing through stained glass windows is also very important in Gothic architecture. You will probably all know that we find common examples in Christian ecclesial architecture, but it's also the architecture of many castle palaces, town halls, guild halls, universities, and some private dwellings. In Brussels, not many Gothic buildings have survived the passage of time. The most famous Gothic buildings that are certainly the town hall of Brussels and the Cathedral Saint-Michel and Gudule. Of course, there are many other churches left, but not really private houses. And when it comes to stained glass windows, I would in particular recommend the stained glass windows in the Church of Notre Dame de Sablon, which I like particular. And you see here in all these pictures again the horizontality. You see the pointed arch in the picture and also in the window, and you see the tracery that is so typical of the architecture of Gothic elements. Now, before I continue with Renaissance, I see that first comments are popping up in the chat. I forgot to mention that I personally cannot see the chat during the presentation, but I will make a break in between so that we can pick up on what is happening in chat and answer your questions. And of course, there will be another question and answer session at the end of the period. So all I'm seeing at the moment is that there is something, the number of the chats, but I cannot see the chat itself because it would block a part of the presentations. You see these these black areas here that are moving around. That's a particularity of Zoom. Anyway, let's move on to the Renaissance. That's the style of European architecture that was between the 14th and the 17th century. And the Renaissance, well, out to its name, you will know, is a conscious revival and the development of certain elements of ancient Greek and Roman thoughts, philosophies, and material cultures. Renaissance developed first in the 15th century in Florence, and it quickly spread over Italian cities and then subsequently over all over the continent. And of course, we all know that Florence is still today the city to go if you want to see Renaissance architecture. So Renaissance puts the Renaissance architecture puts emphasis on style, proportion, geometry, regularity of parts, as we already saw in the classical antiquity and in particular in ancient Greek and Roman architecture. I mean, think about all the temples and that stuff. So orderly arrangement of columns, pillars, lintels, semicircular arches, hemispherical domes. So all that replaced the much more complex and irregular forms of the Gothic architecture that we saw before. One thing that is very characteristic for the Renaissance in more northern regions of Europe, to which Belgium, of course, also belongs, so very characteristic for that is the crow step gable, This is the form of these sort of stepped gables that we typically see, as we can see here in the sketch. The sketch actually depicts the marketplace in Bruges. So, but it's very typical for the Renaissance period in the northern regions. Although the crow step gable actually appeared already in the Gothic period. What is very important to be, or what's necessary to be aware of, is that the Renaissance, and in particular the 16th century, is seen as a sort of a golden age, in particular in Flanders. So this was the period of what we call the Flemish masters in paintings, such as Peter Bruegel the Elder, or Bernard von Orley, and then moving already towards the Baroque period, names like Anton van Dyck or Peter Paul Rubens. So this is a period where what we are talking about, trade is flourishing. So it's as a middle class starts to develop during this period. So this period, this golden age, is seen as a source of the Belgian national pride in parts, and we will see that later again in this presentation. So keep that a little bit in mind. There is no shortage of buildings that look like Renaissance style in the historic center of Brussels, but actually most of them date from the very late 17th or early 18th century, so in principle later than the Renaissance period. And that is because of one of the most important events in Brussels history, the bombardment of 1695. So that's one of the few dates that you may need to memorize in Brussels when it comes to Brussels. And if you go to Grand Place, you will see that all the buildings around Grand Place are dated shortly after 1695. So this bombardment by the troops of the French King Louis XIV, Louis the 14th, took place on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of August 1695. And it resulted into a fire, and the bombarding and the fire completely destroyed large parts of the city of Brussels. A lot of other buildings were damaged. And so it is the most destructive event in the history of Brussels. Brussels fortunately didn't suffer much damage during the First World War, and also the bombardings that took place during the Second World War didn't do remotely as much damage as the bombardment of 1695. So this bombardment of 1695 is then also the main reason, or one of the main reasons, why we do not see more buildings from the Romanesque, Gothic, and Renaissance period, because basically a lot of a lot of what existed in the city of Brussels already at the time was destroyed. From the examples, here are some examples of buildings that managed to survive. We can see some typical examples that define in particular the Flemish version of the Renaissance. I already mentioned the crow step gables, which were very typical, but what is also extremely typical, and you will know that when you're walking through Brussels still today, is these red brick buildings. And then you have white stone decorations, very often coming here in forms of stripes, or like in the lower picture with decorations along the windows or the edges of the building. Keep that a little bit in mind, because we will be coming back to that later. Now the next period is the Baroque, and that's a highly decorative and theatrical style. It developed in Italy in the 17th century, and it took the Renaissance elements that were already there, but it made everything higher, grander, more decorated, more ornate. The more you could throw of it, the better, basically. In Baroque palaces, grand stairways became an example. Elliptic and round shapes, volute, broken gables. We can see here a sketch from the houses on the Grand Place. You can see these typical elements in the gables, rounded shapes on the sides, on the top, but also these volutes. These are these snail-like things here. Are very typical for this period. And as you can see, we have Grand Place, we have the Brussels church, and we have the Mannequin Pis. In Baroque architecture is very present in the architecture of the city, which is of course also due to the bombardment of 1695 that I just mentioned before, because this was the middle of the Baroque period. And of course, after that, what buildings were rebuilt in the style of the time, and that was the Baroque style. We find numerous buildings consequently in the city of Brussels. Most and foremost, of course, the one around the Grand Place, but you know them, so I don't need to show you a picture of those. You've seen them all. A very nice example is the church of Saint-Jean-Baptiste au Béguinage. This is often hailed, and you find that this church actually in most of the guidebooks, one of the finest examples of Flemish Baroque. So it clearly stands out from all the various Baroque churches that we're having in the region. Then the house on Rue Roysbrück, number 29, is a more modest version of a Baroque bourgeois house. Nothing, I mean, compared to the houses on Grand Place. Of course, there's hardly any decoration on this house. So this owner was clearly not able to afford all the decoration or the ornate things, but you can tell clearly from the gable, the rounded shapes in the gable, that this is a house that was built in the Baroque period. And to give an example from outside the city of Brussels, Chaussée Saint-Pierre in Etterbeek, there is an example of a small dwelling that survived in one of the communes. So we've seen 4 styles so far. I don't know, maybe you have already realized that there is a certain pattern in all this. You may remember we started with the relatively simple and geometric Romanesque architecture. Then came the very elaborate Gothic architecture. This was followed by the regular symmetric Renaissance architecture. And now we've arrived in a type of architecture which is in principle hyper ornate shapes, very decorated again. So consequently, what we're going to see next is going to be, it has to be a sober and symmetric style. And so I can welcome you to the neoclassical period, which exactly follows this pattern. And as you will see throughout time, that pattern continues. It's always ornate, basic, ornate, basic, and so the architecture switches back and forth. So the neoclassical movement began in the middle of the 18th century in Italy and France, and it became eventually the most prominent architectural style that we have in the Western Hemisphere, Western world. This style was, of course, profoundly influenced by archaeology. And this was a period when the excavation started in Italy and in Greece. And so all these new discoveries had an influence on society. So neoclassical architecture, the emphasis is on the wall of the building. And of course, the sobriety of that style is a reaction to the excessive Rococo, the excessive Baroque, with the sub-style of the even more excessive Rococo. So that is neoclassicism is again defined by simple symmetric shapes, simple geometry. It looks more at the social demands of the people living in the house instead of the ornament. So the inside was more important than the outside. It picks up elements from the old temples, like columns and these triangular gables, very typical for classicist architecture. And although the heydays of the neoclassicism ended around 1850, actually it never really stopped, and we can still find examples or references to the classical period in what is called the new classical architecture still today. So it never really finished as a style. Excuse me. The neoclassical period was a period of profound change in the history of Brussels. So the city continued to flourish under the Habsburgian regime. It was then annexed to France under Napoleon. And then once Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo, just south of Brussels, the Vienna Congress then decided to attribute this territory that is nowadays Belgium to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which was then newly formed. That didn't last very long. And another important date in the history to remember if you live in Belgium or in Brussels is that in 1830, eventually, the Kingdom of Belgium was formed as we know it today. So Brussels became the capital of the kingdom, and well, the city of Brussels, of course. And consequently, it started growing very rapidly. It always continuously grew over history, but now it really saw an influx of people, all the people that, in particular, an expansion of the middle and upper classes, because this was now the capital. This is where things were happening. And this was a period when Brussels started to outgrow its own city walls. The Quartier Leopold was created, and this is also the first style, so the neoclassical style that we see in larger numbers also outside the city of Brussels in the surrounding communes. So we see here two examples of a house in Schaerbeek. This is a rather large mansion. At that time, it was a countryside home on the top right hand side. And then a more modest example, very, very typical of all the numerous neoclassical houses in Etterbeek, apart, of course, from the fact that the yellow color is something that has been added later on. Of course, initially that house would have been white like all the other neoclassical, or maybe in a very light pastel tone, very light yellow or something like that, but not, almost fluorescent yellow. Nevertheless, with the modern eye, interesting to look at an example from Etterbeek. But I mean, you will probably see countless of these houses wherever you live in, not necessarily wherever you live, but if you live in one of the communes surrounding the city of Brussels, you will find these houses a lot. And then, of course, we have spots within the city of Brussels which were created, like in the bottom right, the Place Royale, which has all the beautiful surrounding neoclassical buildings. The buildings around the Park of Brussels, but also more in the city center, the Place de Martyrs, that these were all projects that were created during the neoclassical period, and they, of course, represent really nicely the neoclassical style. Now, I'm aware that this was a rather quick run through the sort of earlier style, but as I mentioned, I wanted to do that rather quick because I want to focus more on the oncoming styles that I think are more relevant for our daily life. So this may be, I think this is a good moment to see what has happened in the chat, Blanca, to see if there's any questions from anybody. And of course, now that I'm seeing it on the slide, of course, I forgot to mention the beautiful Place Luxembourg, which is of course also surrounded by very typical neoclassical houses. This is what you have to imagine for the whole of the Quartier Leopold. This is what the Quartier Leopold used to look like before it ended up to what it is today. Yeah, Blanca.
Yes, thank you, Alexandros. Well, we have only one comment for the moment in the chat concerning Thomas, who mentioned that about the age of Brussels. I believe some time ago, 2,000-year-old remains of port were found near Tour de Taxi.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could confirm, or you're aware of this.
Yeah, mm-hmm. There are a number. I think there are three Neolithical. There were three sites discovered where people discovered Neolithical, or remains from the Neolithical period. So we know that the area where the area of Brussels was inhabited much longer. The date that I was referring to was, of course, the records that we're having on paper, on documents. So, but of course, the area was already inhabited before. So there is one, as was rightfully mentioned, somewhere in the Tour and Taxi area. The main one is actually near the Parc Tournai-Solvay in the Sognian Forest in Watermark 4. And then there is another one that is along the Woluwe River. Those that have attended my presentation on the Woluwe Valley may remember these things. I'm not sure whether that is now Woluwe Saint-Pierre or Woluwe Saint-Lambert, but one of the two. There's another place where Neolithical remains were found. So, yeah, I mean, there was a continuous inhabitation of Brussels, if you want to say so. Well, basically forever. It's a very fertile. Initially a very fertile, rich land originally.
Thank you. And while the colleagues are maybe sending their comments or their questions, I have also myself. You were talking about the first city wall and the second city wall.
Yes.
Could you please recommend us where to visit, or which is the most? I'm a bit curious about this.
Yeah, let me just quickly go back to the slide so that you can actually see this. Well, let's start with the second city wall, because that's easier. Because the only remain that we still see of the second city wall is Porte de Halle. Otherwise, the second city wall was completely destroyed. Interestingly, the first city wall survived better because it wasn't actually never deliberately destroyed. It was just overbuilt over time. And so it survived as part of walls of other houses. And once the other houses were knocked down, they found, oh, there's a stretch of city wall here. So this example here is Rue de Vipers, near the Place Dunant. Place Dinant, and then there is another stretch on the just on the other side of Place Dinant, which is Rue de l'Empereur. I'm not sure. When you go from the central station towards along this big road towards the Marolles, you pass by the Tour à Naissance, which is another part of the city wall. And then another example that is very visible is, Blanca, you were talking about having had a walk in St. Catherine. Maybe behind the Church of St. Catherine, there is a Tour Noire. There's a single tower standing, actually surrounded on 3 sides by a hotel building. So on the back side of the Church of St. Catherine, that is also a visible remain of the first city wall. There is a little brochure that you can get in for example, in the Halle de Saint-Géry, the tourist information, which has a little walk around the to follow if you want to follow the first and the second city wall. But as I said, from the second wall there isn't anything remaining. Where you can still see the second whistle wall is, this is actually what we call the pentagon on the heart, or the heart. So the Petit Ceinture, the streets actually follow the route of the second city wall. So you can, it's not there anymore, but you can still see where it was.
Thank you so much. And also thank you to the colleagues that were confirming Boulevard de l'Empereur. They were confirming that. Thank you so much. So I think we were very clear. I haven't seen other questions. If you, well, Maria is asking, when was the second city wall demolished?
Starting around 1800 during the Napoleon times. As I said, this was Brussels started growing already, and then the city wall became more of a hindrance. I mean, by that time, a city wall was no longer necessary in terms of defense, and it disturbed the traffic between the city of Brussels and the developing surrounding communes. And so they started demolishing the wall. So yeah, around 1800 to 1840, that sort of period, it was gradually destroyed.
Yeah, thank you. And Maria is also in the chat mentioning sounds similar to the situation in Vienna a bit later in 1857.
I mean, this is I mean, as you can imagine, I mean, as nice as it is to have a city wall, if you look at places like Dubrovnik, for example, I mean, it's a huge, I mean, for modern days, it's a huge burden to traffic. I mean, it's really a problem for nowadays living. So well, yeah, I mean, as nice as it would be to have a city wall, of course, for historic reasons, I mean, it would be a nightmare. There were only 7 gates to enter the city of Brussels, so you can imagine what would happen to traffic nowadays.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. So I think we could move on, as there are no more questions for the moment, and we can.
Yeah, we will have another round at the end of the presentation, so no worries if you still have questions. So I now want to go more into the later styles, which you will probably more recognize in your day-to-day basis. Whatever we saw before, it's also very beautiful and very, very pretty. But first of all, you find it mostly more in the historical center, not so much in the different communes where most of us live, except of course for the neoclassical style, as I mentioned. But now are following the things that are sort of more relevant for us in our day-to-day basis. So we already saw that the neoclassicism was already backwards looking, but as time went by, the neoclassicism gave way to a much larger wave of historism styles. So the 19th century is the period in which in which all of the so-called neo-styles were invented, so the neo-Gothic, neo-Baroque, neo-Renaissance, whatever. So all these are styles of the historism period, or historicism, as it's sometimes also referred to. So this was a period in which many of the European nations formed as they exist today. As I already mentioned, there was the Vienna Congress. If you paid attention to your history lessons in school, you may remember that this was very important in shaping nowadays Europe. Also, the Kingdom of Belgium was created in 1830. And so the architects were looking into ways in how to translate this sort of national pride that was developing, or that developed during this time as the newfound Belgium. So they wanted to bring that national pride into architecture, and they wanted to find that that was distinct to Belgium and its historic figures. So at the same time, they wanted to retain the historical references, but they also wanted to create unseen design. So that was the sort of the outset. There was already quite a complete catalog of all the past styles which they were able to choose from. And then that is what happened is that all the different styles were combined, and that allowed for a more expressive freedom in architecture, and provided an endless source of inspiration. So as I already mentioned, Brussels was expanding just because it became the capital of Belgium. And then now we are in a period where industrialization is in full swing. Brussels is actually the second, Belgium is actually was actually the second most industrialized country after England at that period. So it was really having an influence. Many people moved into the city. And as I said, the city of Brussels itself was already overpopulated during this time. So the communes, the other 18 communes of what we have today in the Brussels capital region, took up a large share of this population growth. And that's why we find the architecture of historism predominantly represented in the communes that have a direct border with the city of Brussels. So things like places like Anderlecht, Saint-Gilles, Etterbeek, Molenbeek. There you will find these things. And so historism had two basic principles. I already mentioned the neo-style, so meaning a revival of the earlier styles, or as I said, you just mix all these styles together, and this is then called eclecticism, and we will also mention Beaux-Arts. The basic rule here is essentially everything goes, there are no rules. So coming first to more what is called revivalism, so the reuse of architecture that already existed before. And in Belgium, because there was this search for national identity, architects looked in particular back into the Renaissance style. As you may remember from the earlier slide, that Renaissance was a golden era, in particular in Flanders. And this was also the period when the bourgeois society established itself and rose to power next to nobility and church. So they started playing a role in governing. And in the 19th century, the ongoing industrialization then resulted into a massive expansion of this bourgeois middle and upper classes. And so to build for these new liberal industrialist elite, architects took inspiration from the Renaissance, because that was also a relatively liberal, science-oriented period, technology-oriented, so the reference to industrialization, but it was also a period which was important for the bourgeois society. So on the right-hand side, we see typical examples of that. So the architect created the so-called Neo-Flemish Renaissance, which took strong inspiration from the actual Renaissance. So we see these elements again, these rounded arches here, the red bricks with the white stripes. Can be seen, crow-step gables pop up again. And so although here it doesn't actually function as a gable, it is just a decorative element. So the look is back just maybe a little bit grander, because of course the industrial elite wanted to show up a little bit. At the same time, there was of course also a more conservative, typically stricter Catholic audience for which architects wanted to build. So for them, the style to go to was Gothic, because we know that Gothic architecture is very well represented in churches, and Catholic, in particular Catholic churches. And so they took inspiration from the Gothic period. Now, there aren't many true Gothic, neo-Gothic houses, and unfortunately, I did not have a picture of a true neo-Gothic house in my collection. So, by the way, yeah. So here you see an example of a house that took up a lot of Gothical elements, which is much more typical actually. So, as I said, while we see a number of neo-Renaissance buildings, we do not see that many neo-Gothic buildings. Where neo-Gothic is more elements. You can see here, while they've used the yellow bricks, they've kept, for example, the white stripes of the Renaissance. So this is a sort of a mixed style, and that leads us immediately to the eclecticism, which is where I said you just throw everything into one bag, you shake it, and whatever comes out is eclectic. So revivalism aimed more or less at meticulously imitating past styles. Eclecticism is quite different. Architects wanted to be original and not necessarily strict to the truly historic. So in these examples here, you see elements from different styles. Here, for example, Renaissance and Baroque mixed. Just as an example, eclecticism later even picked up elements from the Art Nouveau period, which we will be talking about, and in particular, graffiti and stained glass elements became also very popular in eclectic architecture. This is, I mean, you will all know streets like that. This is really, in terms of number of houses, eclecticism is probably the widest represented style that we have in particular in the commune surrounding the city of Brussels. Towards the end of the historism period, we see Beaux-Arts, which is coming from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, sorry. So Beaux-Arts translated fine arts. So the fine arts in Paris was very famous as a school for architecture, and it started then influencing architecture in Western styles, in Western societies. Yeah, and as you can see from the picture, it's it's again lots of decorative elements. All the sobriety of the neoclassical period is gone. We are more looking into Baroque and Rococo formulas, but also into French neoclassicism. Think of the great French palaces, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI. This is what defines the style of Beaux-Arts. Symmetry again, sculptures. We find classical details like balustrades. Also, the triangle gable from the classical period is back. So this style arrived towards the end of the historism period, end of the 19th centuries. And you may also know that this is a time which is often referred to as Belle Époque or fin de siècle, the time before the First World War, because the First World War changed society a lot, and consequently also the society changed. But before we go into the First World War, just there was another style coming up before the First World War, and that was the Art Nouveau. And I already mentioned that Art Nouveau was super important for Brussels, or is super important for Brussels, because the first Art Nouveau building was erected here in Brussels. In principle, it shares the same time period with the Beaux-Arts, but while the Beaux-Arts style was the preferred choice for the more conservative elite, Art Nouveau, which was a highly controversial style at the time, was ultra modern, was something for the more progressive society. So Art Nouveau is, I see, I mean, that's more my personal interpretation, but I see Art Nouveau as a kind of intermediate style that creates a bridge between the historism that we just saw before and modernism, which we will see next. And it's a style that has, in a way, also a split personality, because there are two main schools. There's a floral Art Nouveau, which we see actually represented here in the sketches, but there's also a geometric school in Art Nouveau, which we will see in a minute. And it's also in the philosophy, in principle, the idea of Art Nouveau, or new art, if you translate that into English, was to overcome all this historism and all this backwards looking in terms of architecture, looking back to the historic catalogue of architecture. The Art Nouveau architects wanted to create something new. So they wanted to overcome this societal, but then in turn, Art Nouveau was so elaborate and so expensive to build that it was only affordable for the richest part of the society, which is somewhat, yeah, of course, contradicting. On one side, you want to go away from that society, but then you actually serve that society. So it was a bit of a in my personal interpretation, it was a bit of a split there. Another aspect is that on one side, Art Nouveau rejected the idea of the industrialization and products produced by industry, which were considered as a poor quality. Art Nouveau was all about craftsmanship and bespoke elements in buildings. So although on one side they rejected industrialization, but on the other side they took full advantage by using all the modern products that came along with industrialization. So iron, new forms of glass, ceramics, concrete, those were all new building materials that were coming up at the time and readily taken up by Art Nouveau. So on one side, a rejection of the idea of industrialization, but on the other side, taking advantage of it. I mean, there's no way I can do justice to the Art Nouveau here in this presentation, so I'm not going to even pretend but I mean, for every style is very individual on its own. It was a very short-lived fashion, actually, and it came to a rapid end with the First World War. Now we see here some examples of the floral style of Art Nouveau buildings. On the left, we see the Hôtel Tassel, which is the building that is considered the first Art Nouveau building in 1893. And what was in particular new, apart from the forms, was also the fact that Art Nouveau started showcasing structural elements as decoration of a building. You see this here in these iron structures that you can actually see in the architecture, and that was something that was unseen before. Stained glass windows, I mean, you will probably know that from when you've visited Art Nouveau houses, are a critical element in Art Nouveau. There's a whole philosophy behind it, which is super interesting, but I'm afraid I'm not having the time to show it here, but I will probably do a separate presentation on Art Nouveau itself, because it's a very interesting philosophical idea behind it as well. So those were some examples of the floral styles. So also here I wanted to show you some examples of the more geometric style. So you see already quite angular forms in the building on the bottom left, the Palais Stockley, but also on the top right, although it's more curvy, you still have relatively, well, first of all, symmetry and relatively clear lines, by far not as sinuous as the floral Art Nouveau style. What we also see on this slide are two examples of graffiti, one extremely fine example and one of the sort of more standard examples. Again, a technique that is actually very ancient, but was very popular in the in particular for the Belgian Art Nouveau movement, so it was not invented by Art Nouveau, but it was reused. And as I mentioned, these graffiti also show up in a lot of eclectic buildings. As a matter of fact, the picture that you're seeing here is indeed can make up the red bricks and the white stripes. This is actually indeed coming from an eclectic building as an example. So don't get confused. The graffitis are very typical for Art Nouveau buildings, but they're not exclusive to Art Nouveau buildings. Yeah, so the First World War brought with it a big change in society, and that all was also reflected in architecture. After the First World War, the Art Deco buildings made of steel, reinforced concrete began to appear in Europe and in the United States. And so the Art Deco used modern styles with fine craftsmanship and rich materials. And during its heyday, the Art Deco was the symbol for luxury, glamour, exuberance, and the faith in social and technological progress. There is Art Deco buildings have very clean lines, rectangular forms, as seen in the top sketch. New materials, again, like the Art Deco, like the Art Nouveau, also the Art Deco explored everything that was available to it. But the Art Deco buildings marked a very clear break to the ornate styles. So we're having again a break from a very ornate period into a more sober period in terms of architecture. And so the ornate Beaux-Arts style and the floral Art Nouveau style have gone out of the window, but you can see that some of the lines that developed during as a geometric Art Nouveau, they found their continuation in the Art Deco. There's a sub-style of Art Deco, which I will also address, which is called streamline modernism, and that's more in the bottom building. You may recognize that building on Place Flagey. And this, as I will explain that in one of the next slides. So Art Deco started after the First World War, basically, and of course the next big thing was the Great Depression, and by that time, during the Great Depression, Art Deco became a little bit more subdued. It became a bit more rounded, and again, new materials arrived, including chrome-plated chrome plating, stainless steel, and plastic entered into the architecture. Art Deco also inspired very much the designers of ocean liners. You may be aware that the time between the wars was a great period for the ocean liners. And in particular, because the Art Deco style was linked to luxury and glamour, There was an influence there, and then in turn the nautical themes of ships inspired architects to develop the substyle of streamlined modernism that I mentioned already. Streamlined modernism is a sleeker form of Art Deco and was, as I said, inspired by ships, but also more in general by the increasingly aerodynamic style of cars, planes, and trains that developed during this period. So it can actually also very often be found in buildings of the time that are linked to means of transport, so train stations, airport terminals, roadside cafes, port buildings, and these sort of things. Streamlined modernism one can see that as a little bit of a mix between Art Deco and modernism itself, because the streamlined modernism already picks up a number of elements of modernism itself predominantly. I forgot to mention that for the Art Deco period, sorry. Art Deco period has, again, like the Gothic, has a vertical orientation, whereas streamlined modernism and modernism in general has a vertical orientation. So, sorry, a horizontal orientation. So that's how one can distinguish the different styles. So you can see here clearly, well, rounded shapes and a more horizontal orientation, and in particular on corner buildings, you almost have sometimes the impression that you're looking at a ship from the front. Rounded shapes that can also be seen as a representation of waves. These are all elements that are typical for the streamlined modernism. Now going slightly back in time, modernism developed at the same time as the Art Deco, but it was an even more radical break with the traditions. Also, unlike Deco, modernism didn't vanish with the Second World War. So Art Deco was actually between the war period, if you want to say so. Whereas modernism actually became then the dominant architectural style after the Second World War. And although the heydays are over, it was since the 1980s, it's gradually being replaced by postmodern architecture, but we still see modernist buildings and references to modernist buildings today. Again, modernism is built on new and innovative technologies. It developed at the same time as Art Deco, but it had a sort of a slightly different philosophy than Art Deco architecture. And the main thing here was the concept that the form of the building should follow its function. So the famous form follows function formula, which you find in many other design schools as well. And that principle is also known as functionalism in terms, not only in architecture, but in all sorts of, whatever you can design, you will come across the term form follows function very often. So as a consequence, modernist architecture comes rather minimalistic because it rejects all sorts of ornamentation, and an ornament is not necessary for the functioning of the building. So out with it. If it's not necessary for the function, it is not shown. One other change in comparison to Art Deco was also that modernist buildings were expected to be modular and light, so they should have an overall lightness to them, and we will see that on one of the following slides as well. A side effect of this minimalism was that modernism became very popular wherever economic aspects played a role, because if you have no ornaments, if you use modern construction technologies, of course, that is making the whole construction much cheaper than compared to traditional styles. Now, the early modernism, so the modernism before the Second World War, was, and in particular, what we call the functionalism, so the form follows function, was often linked to socialist, humanist, and egalitarian political ideas. And so in particular for the private houses, the philosophy was also a little bit that the outside of the house should no longer show whether the inhabitant is actually rich or poor. They all share the same. They all share the same architecture, and so there shouldn't be two different styles of architecture depending on your income. But due to this link to this modernist idea, of course, well, not of course, it was rejected by the majority of the conservative society, so in particular in the beginning it didn't really took off. But then, as I said, in particular after the Second World War, it became the dominant style of architecture. And the second sub-style of modernism that I wanted to mention here is the international style, also sometimes referred to as functionalism. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish these two. So this is defined by simple rectangular shapes, the total absence of ornamentation. Ornamentation is only coming through the structural elements, as you can see in the examples. Open interior spaces, generally a certain lightness to it, not many walls visible in that sense. So it's mostly exemplified by the high-rise office buildings that we see from the 1960s to the 1990s. But under this bracket of international functionalism, you may have also heard of architectural style like the Bauhaus. We talk about a lot of new European Bauhaus at the moment, so you probably heard the term before. And also Le Corbusier was also all falling under this international functionalist movement. And then the final form of modernism that came along is the so-called brutalism. That developed basically during the House Crisis after the Second World War, in particular in the United Kingdom. This form of architecture emerged. It's characterized by minimalist constructions that showcases the bare building materials and structural elements. So there's nothing so you see the actual structure and the materials of what the buildings are made of. And so typically you see the bare concrete, angular geometric shapes, monochrome color palettes, and these sort of things. Yeah, one of the problems with this architectural style that was very often used for low-cost social housing, because it was in principle it could be very cheap. I mean, the examples that I'm showing here are not really cheap examples of brutalism, but I mean, you all know these big housing blocks. These are examples of brutalism, and because it was became connected to social housing and the deterioration of those houses, it became eventually very unpopular. It's still today the style that is probably mostly controversial, where people either like or hate it. It's the most polarized style of all the architectural styles. Now, finally, we arrived in the now time. Postmodernism, as I mentioned, started in the 1970s. It started replacing modernism. Modernism, very sober style, and of course, what has to follow is something that is not sober, and that is again with ornation. So It is a style that is a reaction against the austerity of the modernist style, and it reintroduced ornament, color, decoration, and in particular also a human scale to buildings, meaning that architects now also started to look more into what is actually the purpose, how are the people supposed to work within these buildings. So postmodernism is also often referred to as neo-eclecticism, because it features very often it features elements borrowed from earlier periods. And the postmodern architecture is particularly relevant for all of us here that you're listening, because it's actually the style in which most buildings that are now occupied by the European institutions were built. So this includes the European Parliament, Covent Garden, the Triangle, the Bredale buildings, Justus Lipsus, the Europa building, and many, many more. Also, the new buildings that we have, Copernicus and the One, are in a postmodern style. And in the European Quarter, the style is also very prominent around Place Jean Rey, which we see here in the top, a very nice example of a post-modern architecture. And that is the style that we are still living in, that is still ongoing. So we will have to wait for what's coming next. What I can promise you is going to be a sober style without any, with the rejection of ornament again, because that's what we've always seen, always is switch from ornate, sober between the periods. So yeah, postmodern is ornate, so the next one is going to be sober again, whatever it is going to be. So with this, we're coming to an end to our virtual excursion through the architectural styles that we are having here in Brussels. I hope you enjoyed this very rapid time travel through 1,000 years of history of architecture here in Brussels. And yeah, that you see that you've seen some of the historic styles that we see primarily in the city of Brussels, and some more of the more recent style, 19th and 20th century, that we see predominantly, well, we see spread over. And hopefully actually you can now test your knowledge with this slide while we are answering questions, because this slide in a more or less chronological order lists a few styles that the more recent styles that I mentioned. But no, I'm not going to ask you for that. There's no test, so you can, it's just a self-test for yourself, whether you paid attention or not. And yeah, if you're interested, of course, we are going to complement this walk also with a little bit of practice. As Blanca mentioned earlier, we are organizing walks, and if you're interested, you can join our Microsoft Teams group. It is not yet established right, but it will be coming in the next days, and you will be getting the information email after this presentation, which gives you the link to this presentation and also all the details on how to get more information. So now the time is yours. We have only very few minutes left, but if there are any questions, remarks, corrections, whatever you may have noted, feel free to express yourself. And at that moment already, thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alexandros, for this fantastic presentation. I'm still impressed in how you managed to go through so many centuries and styles in such a fantastic way. So thanks you very much for this great presentation. And we still have a couple of questions in the chat. Colleague is asking, Flora, what is the style of the Galerie de la Reine or Galerie Saint-Hubert in Brussels?
That's also eclecticism. It picks up styles from the Renaissance predominantly, but with a few interpretations. There's a few neoclassical elements in there as well. So this was built in the late 19th century. I think 1870s or something like that. So this is the period of historism.
Thank you. And another colleague, Maria, is also asking about the building at the Barrière de Saint-Gilles. Do you know which you was asking which kind of style as well? Can I maybe share the screen? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean that from my memory now, I would think it's probably eclectic as well, because that's the period. Yes, it's an eclectic apartment building, having some influences from already picking up from the so you see it's red bricks with white stripes. So there's a little bit of neoclassical Renaissance in there. On top, you have a sort of a rounded gable, so maybe a little bit Baroque influenced in there. The ground floor horizontal lines is that the arcades is a little more neoclassical. So yeah, you have a very nice example of a very eclectic building there.
Thank you so much. And maybe the last question, we jumped a little bit across the border. And she's asking also, Maria, what kind of architecture are the buildings in Paris after the Haussmann redesign of the city?
I would think mostly Beaux-Arts, because this is the style that was designed to represent French architecture as I said, the equivalent to what we have here in Belgium in terms of neo-Flemish Renaissance. For France, this was the Beaux-Arts style, and all the boulevards, the Haussmann boulevards, they are all built up in Beaux-Arts, similar to what we have here on Boulevard Ansbach. This is also a little bit in that sort of Parisian flair or style.
Well, thank you so much. So now it's up to us to start walking around Brussels and choose our favorite styles, I would say, and take advantage of all the information that you share with us. And indeed, as we were mentioning before, we will share with you the information on the guided tours that Alexandros and other colleagues from the Hello Brussels initiative are offering to all of us, not only during the working time, but I think we also organize during the weekends as well. So for those who are very busy during the week, Alexandros and other colleagues are so nice that even during the weekend you organize also this kind of tour. So thank you so much. You see the chat is very active now, and we thanks also all the participants. As we mentioned before, you will get the link to the recording and the slides, as well as information on the future group in Microsoft Teams that we are, for the moment the group exists but it's private, so we will open it to all of us, and then you will be informed of all the activities. So great, thanks Alexandros once again, and I will invite now to Benedict, if you can close the session, please.